Dear students, after studying this module, you shall be able to know about the functions of different lobes, learn about the functions of the frontal lobes in particular, identify the different functional areas within the frontal lobes, learn about frontal lobe functions and dysfunctions, understand the problems associated with the damage of frontal lobes. Human body is a complex structure comprising of different systems that carry out various functions. For instance, the human nervous system constitutes a network of cells that help in carrying information to and from all parts to the body. One of the divisions of the nervous system known as the central nervous system and the other being peripheral nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. These two components of the nervous system control the life-sustaining functions of the body, thought and other cognitive processes, emotions and behavior. The human brain is larger than that of any other primate when corrected for body size, more than 3 times larger than that of a chimpanzee. Although the brain is exceedingly complicated and understanding of the basic features of brain development makes it easier for an individual to learn the location of most important structures. In the period of embryonic development, the brain starts out as a thin tube and ends in a structure weighing approximately 1400 grams and constituting of several hundred billions of cells. Brain is a large mass of neurons, glia and other supporting cells. As can be seen by an observer, brain is the most protected organ of the body, which is encased in a very tough, bony skull. It is floating in a pool of cerebrospinal fluid. To maintain its effective functioning, which is indispensable for an individual's survival, the brain also receives a copious supply of blood and is chemically guarded by the blood-brain barrier. There are 3 main divisions of the brain organized around the 3 chambers of the tube that develops early in embryonic life: the forebrain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. The brain is the most important component of the nervous system and it is the part that takes the information received from the senses, makes sense of this information, making decisions using it, and sends commands to the muscles and the rest of the body to execute innumerable daily life functions. Therefore, it may be said that a human being will cease to exist without brain, since it supports all the life support processes also. Major thought processes, cognitive higher functions, decision making, problem solving and adopting strategies of survival are carried out at the level of cerebral cortex, cerebrum or the brain. The 4 major lobes. The cortex, rim or the outer covering, is the outermost part of the brain. It is made up of tightly packed neurons and actually is only about 1/10 of an inch thick on average. The tissue of the cortex appears greyish pink because of the neural bodies which are grey and the small blood vessels which are pink in color. The cortex is very recognizable because it is full of wrinkles and it is the part of the brain most people picture when they think of what the brain looks like. The convulsions, the wrinkles consisting of sulci and fissures and gyri greatly enlarge the surface area of the cortex compared with the smooth brain of the same size. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of the surface of the cortex is hidden in the grooves. The total surface area of around 2.5 square feet and the thickness is around 3 mm. The cortex is wrinkled because it allows a much larger area of cortical cells to exist in the small space inside the skull since the brain develops before birth. It serves as a covering of other brain structures. The cortex gets more and more wrinkled as the brain increases in size and complexity. This increase in wrinkling is called corticalization and is the real measure of human intelligence. The cortex is divided into 2 sections called the cerebral hemispheres, which are connected by a thick, tough band of neural bodies called the corpus callosum, meaning hard bodies. Each cerebral hemisphere can further be divided into 4 sections by looking at the deeper wrinkles or fissures on its surface. Lobes are divided into 4 parts: occipital, parietal, frontal and temporal. Occipital lobes. At the base of the cortex towards the back of the brain is the area known as the occipital lobe, where the word occipital means rear of the head. This area processes visual information from the eyes in the primary visual cortex, which is located on the upper and lower banks of the calcarine fissure. Calcarine means spur-shaped. The visual association cortex is the part of the brain that helps identify and make sense of the visual information from the eye. Each area of the cortex has association areas that help people make sense of the sensory information. Parietal lobe. The parietal, meaning wall, lobes are at the top and back of the brain, just under the parietal bone in the skull. This area processes information from the skin and internal body receptors for touch, taste, temperature and body position. This area comprises of somatosensory cortex, an area of neurons running down the front of the parietal lobes on either side of the brain. Temporal lobes. The temporal lobes, where temporal refers to off or near the temples, are found just behind the temples of the head. The temporal lobe comes from the base of the brain, ventral to the frontal and the parietal lobe. These lobes contain the primary auditory cortex, which receives auditory information and which is located on the upper surface of the deep fissure on the side of the brain lateral fissure and the auditory association area. If a person receives a blow to the side of the head, that person will probably hear a ringing sound. Also found in the left temporal lobe is an area that in most people is particularly involved with language. Frontal lobes. Frontal lobes are situated in the front of the brain, hence the name frontal lobes. This part performs all higher cognitive processes: memory, storage, planning, decision making among others. The frontal lobe also helps in controlling emotions by means of its connection to the limbic system. People with damage to this area may also experience problems with performing mental tasks, getting stuck on one step or one wrong answer and repeating it over and over. The frontal lobes constitute motor cortex, which controls the movements of the body's voluntary muscles by sending commands out to the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system. Divisions of the frontal lobe. The orbitofrontal cortex. The medial and anterior part of the frontal cortex refer to the orbitofrontal cortex. Orbitofrontal cortex is involved in cost-benefit analysis of any situation, and it is also involved in execution of moral judgment on the part of an individual. Damage to this area of the frontal lobe may cause a person to have normal or at times superior intelligence that can be measured using tools like IQ tests. However, such people may lack knowledge of behavior useful to become a healthy part of the society. These people may lack basic mannerisms and act in an unusual manner in a given social circumstance. Moreover, such people may engage in risk-taking behavior. Primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex, also known as Brodmann's area 4, is located in precentral gyrus area of the cerebral cortex, just anterior to the central sulcus, and it is the most posterior portion of the frontal lobe. The brain is able to control the muscles from spinal cord with the help of the projections from primary motor cortex. It has been found that this brain region is involved in voluntary muscle contraction. This has been proven through various ways, like electrical stimulation of Brodmann's areas results in contraction of skeletal muscles, and damage to this region results in paralysis and loss of fine movement control, also known as apraxia. Supplementary motor cortex. All of the motor impulses that originate at the cortical level in cortex of brain travel through pyramidal system, also known as direct activation pathways. This neural pathway supplies the voluntary muscles of the neck, head and limbs. Neurons of this tract originate in the precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex. The pyramidal system can be further divided into two different tracts, corticospinal and corticobulbar. Although the pyramidal system is the primary neural pathway for voluntary movement, the extrapyramidal system is another motor system that is important for control of movements. Neural activity for extrapyramidal system originates in the cerebral cortex and ultimately exerts an influence on the lower motor neurons terminating in the brainstem, controlling somatic motor activity in the head. Example, muscles controlling eye movement, muscles of mastication, muscles of facial expression. The pathways for this system are indirect as opposed to the direct pathways of the pyramidal system. The long axons of the corticospinal tract and corticobulbar tract make only one synapse with the lower motor neuron, so the pyramidal system is called monosynaptic. The extrapyramidal system, however, is polysynaptic. Prefrontal cortex. The area of the brain rostral to the motor association cortex is known as prefrontal cortex. The region is less involved in controlling the movement and more in formulating plans and strategies that may help the person in the current or future contingency situations. In humans, the prefrontal cortex takes up the major area of the frontal lobe. This region is very important to undertake almost all tasks and skills requiring intelligence. The prefrontal cortex tends to be larger in primates than other mammals and is larger in humans than in other primates. This is correlated with the amount of high-level planning done by members of different species. After all, it is evident from our history that human beings have come a long way from thinking about hunting and gathering to thinking about inventing highly advanced technology. Most mammals operate on a rudimentary level and do not engage in complex social situations. Primates, on the other hand, have complex male and female hierarchies and may hatch plots against each other or may work together towards a desired goal that span years of planning. Of all primates, human beings have the most complex of all observed social structures. One must scale a labyrinth of social formalities in order to obtain personal goals, taking into account thousands other individuals that may constitute one's social web. Therefore, in order to function effectively in such a complex setup, one requires adequate planning, which is afforded by prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex plays a significant role in influencing the personality characteristics of a person. The activation of the prefrontal cortex may reflect its role in inhibiting aggressive behavior. Rain et al. Found evidence of decreased prefrontal activity and increased subcortical activity, including amygdala, in the brains of convicted murderers who were impulsive and emotional. However, cold-blooded, calculated, predatory murderers whose crimes were not accompanied by rage and anger showed normal level of prefrontal activity. Presumably, the decreased activation of the prefrontal cortex reflected a decreased ability to control one's emotions. In fact, Rain et al. Found that people with antisocial personality disorder showed an 11% reduction in volume of a gray matter of the prefrontal cortex. Frontal lobe's dysfunctions. In a nutshell, frontal lobe serves many functions like planning and movement control. It controls bodily muscles and contributes to the understanding of personality characteristics of individuals. There have been many problems associated with malfunctioning of frontal lobe like attention deficits, disturbance of movements, aphasia, among others. There may be several causes of such damage. Closed head injuries, for example, from motor vehicle accidents, can cause damage to the orbitofrontal cortex. Prefrontal lobotomies and antipsychotic drugs serving connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain are effectively a form of iatrogenic trauma resulting in frontal lobe syndrome. Cerebrovascular disease may cause a stroke in the frontal lobe. Tremors such as meningitis may present with a frontal lobe syndrome. Frontal lobe impairment is also a feature of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and Pick's disease. Attention disorder is one of the specific behavior deficits following frontal lobe damage, patients showing distractibility and poor attention. Patients present with poor memory, sometimes referred to as forgetting to remember. The thinking of patients with frontal lobe injury tends to be concrete and fixed, with a tendency to get stuck on one step, which is known as perseveration. Aphasia following frontal lobe damage is characterized by usage of language by patient that lacks coherence, the discourse is socially inappropriate and disinhibited, and the patient may confabulate, fabrication of experience. Luria described this as dynamic aphasia. Disinhibition and euphoria have also featured in the list of abnormalities associated with frontal lobe. The euphoria is not that of a manic condition, normally characterized by period of overexcitement, but rather it has an empty quality to it. The disinhibition can lead to marked abnormalities of behavior, sometimes associated with outbursts of irritability and aggression, disturbances of movement and perseveration, that is getting stuck on step or one wrong answer and repeating it over and over again, are linked to lesions of the lateral frontal cortex. Moreover, damage to medial frontal lobes is marked by akinesia associated with mutism, gait disturbances and incontinence. Other dysfunctions associated with frontal lobe includes reduced activity, particularly a diminution of spontaneous activity, lack of drive, inability to plan ahead, and lack of concentration. Sometimes associated with this are bouts of restlessness and aimless, uncoordinated behavior. Affect may also be distributed, which is observed in the patient's apathy, emotional blunting, and an indifference to the world around him. Some specific pathology related to frontal lobe damage may be described as Foster's-Kennedy syndrome is caused due to tumor of frontal lobe. It gives rise to ipsilateral optic atrophy and contralateral papilledema. Other disorders are frontal disinhibition syndrome, Rett syndrome, and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. This may also be caused by the frontal lobe damaging, often due to tumors. The individuals suffering from these disorders may also exhibit socially disinhibited behavior and severe impairment of judgment, insight, and foresight. Antisocial behavior is also a characteristic feature of frontal disinhibition syndrome. Frontal abulic syndrome is characterized by loss of initiative, creativity, and curiosity, pervasive emotional apathy and blandness. Akinetic mutism may occur due to damage to speech areas of the frontal cortex. Since frontal lobes are involved with executive functions, any damage to them may cause lack of cognitive functions. Urinary incontinence can occur in lesion of paracentral lobule area of frontal lobe. Other such deficits are the short attention span, poor short-term memory, difficulty in planning and reasoning, and the environmental dependence syndrome, in which the individual is tightly restricted to the current environment, not able to think ahead at all. Since frontal lobes are also connected to the limbic system via nucleus accumbens, any damage to these lobes is exhibited via emotional disturbance. Difficulty in inhibiting emotions, anger, excitement, sadness, etc., depression and occasional difficulty in understanding others' points of view, leading to anger and frustration, may also result in this context. Other non-adaptive behaviors include perseveration, inappropriate aggression, inappropriate sexual behavior, lack of humor, and unprovoked agitation. Grasp reflex, palmomental response, and rooting reflex deficits may occur due to the major motor functions of the frontal lobes. Frontal lobe functions and syndromes with personality change are well known for about 150 years, but intricacies of their underlying anatomical and physiological mechanisms have started to unfold in the recent years. The frontal lobe accommodates an extension of the primary motor cortex, the premotor region and the interhemispherical supplementary motor region. They form Area 6 and its subdivisions. The anterior and the inferior frontal structures are also the eye field. Area 8 belong to the prefrontal region. The prefrontal cortex is also involved in motor action, in its initiation, planning, designing and sequencing rather than its mere execution. This requires drive and initiation to move. So, deficits in these areas results in moderate to extreme apathy. Forces of motivation are likely to be mediated via the fronto-orbital cortex, known as an extension of the temporal limbic system. It also exerts inhibitory influence on prefrontal functioning and thus is the basis of disinhibitory frontal lobe syndromes. Such syndromes are the result of frontobasal impairment. A special form of frontal motor cortex disconnection may occur in childhood in the rare Rett syndromes and with damage to the prefrontal cortex in the common attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The initiation of movement is based upon the constant influx of efferent sensory messages from posterior cerebral regions and strong mesodorsal thalamic connections which provides information for each prefrontal motor impulse. This working memory appears to be the keystone of mental and motor prefrontal functions, becoming unnecessary in the next movements. The efferent signals undergoes immediate extinction due to inhibitory fronto-orbital impulses. It is assumed that the classical absence of generalized spike waves of frontal onset causes a momentary suspension of the working memory and thus permits immediate repercussions of frontal functions. The gap between efferent and efferent signals in the working memory is likely to permit neurocognitive processes. In Homo sapiens, a widened gap is thought to provide a basis for reflection and cognition, which are the unique human properties. Summary: each of the two hemispheres of the brain can be further divided into 4 sections due to the deep wrinkles or fissures in its surface. Frontal lobes constitute primary motor cortex, which controls the movements of the body's voluntary muscles. Orbitofrontal cortex is involved in cost-benefit analysis of any situation and is also involved in execution of moral judgment. Pyramidal system supplies the voluntary muscles of neck, head and limbs. Extrapyramidal system is involved in controlling somatic motor activities in the head. Example: muscles controlling eye movement, muscles of mastication, muscles of facial expression. Prefrontal cortex controls personality characteristics, impulse control, decision making, all kinds of reasoning and problem solving. There have been many problems associated with malfunctioning of frontal lobe like attention deficit, disturbance of movement, aphasia, impulsivity, disturbance in speech production, etc.